left in confusion and consternation. Before the Master began his terrible denunciation of the Jewish rulers, Judas had returned to the temple, so that all 12 heard this latter half of Jesus' last discourse in the temple. It is unfortunate that Judas Iscariot could not have heard the first and mercy-proffering half of this farewell address. He did not hear this last offer of mercy to the Jewish rulers because he was still in conference with a certain group of Sadducean relatives and friends with whom he had lunched, and with whom he was conferring as to the most fitting manner of dissociating himself from Jesus and his fellow apostles. It was while listening to the Master's final indictment of the Jewish leaders and rulers that Judas finally and fully made up his mind to forsake the gospel movement and wash his hands of the whole enterprise. Nevertheless, he left the temple in company with the 12, went with them to Mount Olivet, where, with his fellow apostles, he listened to that fateful discourse on the destruction of Jerusalem and the end of the Jewish nation, and remained with them that Tuesday night at the new camp near Gethsemane. The multitude who heard Jesus swing from his merciful appeal to the Jewish leaders into that sudden and scathing rebuke which bordered on ruthless denunciation were stunned and bewildered. That night, while the Sanhedrin sat in death judgment upon Jesus, and while the Master sat with his apostles and certain of his disciples out on the Mount of Olives foretelling the death of the Jewish nation, all Jerusalem was given over to the serious and suppressed discussion of just one question: what will they do with Jesus? At the home of Nicodemus, more than 30 prominent Jews who were secret believers in the kingdom met and debated what course they would pursue in case an open break with the Sanhedrin should come. All present agreed that they would make open acknowledgment of their allegiance to the Master in the very hour they should hear of his arrest, and that is just what they did. The Sadducees, who now controlled and dominated the Sanhedrin, were desirous of making way with Jesus for the following reasons. 1. They feared that the increased popular favor with which the multitude regarded him threatened to endanger the existence of the Jewish nation by possible involvement with the Roman authorities. 2. His zeal for temple reform struck directly at their revenues. The cleansing of the temple affected their pocketbooks. 3. They felt themselves responsible for the preservation of social order, and they feared the consequences of the further spread of Jesus' strange and new doctrine of the brotherhood of man. The Pharisees had different motives for wanting to see Jesus put to death. They feared him because 1. He was arrayed in telling opposition to their traditional hold upon the people. The Pharisees were ultra-conservative, and they bitterly resented these supposedly radical attacks upon their vested prestige as religious teachers. 2. They held that Jesus was a lawbreaker, that he had shown utter disregard for the Sabbath and numerous other legal and ceremonial requirements. 3. They charged him with blasphemy because he alluded to God as his Father. 4. And now were they thoroughly angry with him because of his last discourse of bitter denunciation which he had this day delivered in the temple as the concluding portion of his farewell address. The Sanhedrin, having formally decreed the death of Jesus and having issued orders for his arrest, adjourned on this Tuesday near midnight, after appointing to meet at 10 o'clock the next morning at the home of Caiaphas the high priest, for the purpose of formulating the charges on which Jesus should be brought to trial. A small group of the Sadducees had actually proposed to dispose of Jesus by assassination, but the Pharisees utterly refused to countenance such a procedure. And this was the situation in Jerusalem and among men on this eventful day, while a vast concourse of celestial beings hovered over this momentous scene on earth, anxious to do something to assist their beloved sovereign, but powerless to act because they were effectively restrained by their commanding superiors.